Have you ever felt like everything on the outside of your life was going really well, but you knew that something on the inside wasn't going as well as it could be? Welcome to part 3 of our series entitled Halftime. We said at the beginning of this series that our culture today has a scoreboard for life that primarily focuses on the external things of our lives, like what we do, how much we have, what people think and say about us, all of the external numbers that people measure today. But what we said was really important is not just what's happening on the outside of our lives, but really what's happening on the inside. In fact, we said at the end of part 1 of this series that we want the second half of our life or the second half of our year or the post-halftime talk to help us focus more on the internal than on the external. By the end of today's video, I want to give you an ancient practice that's been incredibly helpful for me to help me focus more on the internal and less on the external. But there's a problem that we all face. It's a cultural problem that I think is a major hurdle for helping us to practice this ancient tool and to begin focusing more on the internal and less on the external. So before we take a look at the practice, let's quickly recap what we've learned so far, and then I want to share with you this hurdle that is in the way between us and this ancient practice. As a quick recap, we discovered in week 1 of this series that it's more important for us to focus on the internal than it is on the external. It's more important for us to focus on who we want to become than what we just want to get done. Our halftime talk told us that we want to focus more on who we want to become, less on what we think we need to get done. In part 2 of this series, we discovered an ancient practice of silence, solitude, and stillness that helps us to focus on the internal more than the external. In fact, we said it this way, that silence is like sunlight for the soul. Just like sunlight feeds a plant and helps it to grow, silence is like sunlight for our soul. It feeds our soul and it's the fuel to help us grow into the person that we want to become. So, what's the hurdle that is between us and this next ancient practice that we're going to discover today? One of the things that our culture has taught us to do is try to accumulate and collect experiences and things all throughout our life. You may have heard it once said that the man with the most toys at the end of the day wins. Well, nowadays, I think some people have realized that that's not really true, but they've exchanged collecting things for collecting experiences. So the person with the most experiences at the end of their life wins. But here's what I've learned about experiences. Experiences alone don't help you to become the person that you want to become. In fact, oftentimes people say that experiences are a really good teacher. But the truth is, evaluated experiences are a great teacher. It's evaluated experience that leads to becoming the person that we want to become. Mindlessly going through life collecting experiences leads to shallow thinking, and shallow thinking actually leads to shallow people. So we want to pause long enough to evaluate our experiences, because experiences alone, yes, they're a great teacher, but evaluated experiences are an even better teacher and will help us to become the person that we want to become. So let's take a look at this ancient practice of evaluated experience that will help us to become the person that we want to become. There's an ancient Jewish proverb that was most likely written by King Solomon, who was the 3rd king of Israel, in which we find this ancient practice. He says this in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 32. He says, "I applied my heart to what I observed and learned a lesson from what I saw." Now, to give you some context, King Solomon had just observed a man who was lazy and seen both his property and his life fall into ruin. From that negative experience that he observed in somebody else's life, he turned it into a positive lesson of who he wanted to become. He wanted to become a person that wasn't lazy. Now, when we take a look at this verse, at this proverb, we can see some key things here that we can apply to our lives today to help us become the type of person that we want to become. It says at the beginning of the proverb, he applied his heart. That means that he looked inward. That means he looked at the home of his feelings and emotions, his heart, to be able to learn a lesson from what he saw. I don't know about you, but I grew up in an environment that didn't necessarily encourage people to pay attention to their feelings and their emotions. In fact, the environment I grew up in was quite skeptical of following your feelings and your emotions. It was really encouraged to look at the truth, specifically the truth of God's Word, to find out the direction you should go in your life, not necessarily to pay attention to your feelings and emotions. The idea was this, that your feelings and emotions, they can change from one moment to the next. But the truth, specifically in God's Word, it's always constant. So the encouragement was to not pay attention to your feelings and emotions, but to pay attention primarily to the truth of God's Word. Now, I imagine Solomon grew up in a very different environment than I did, because his dad, King David, the second king of Israel, spent a lot of time paying attention to his emotions. In fact, I think this proverb that Solomon wrote is probably a reflection of his experience with his father growing up. David did an incredible job of paying attention to his heart, to observing his feelings, and to paying attention to his emotions. In fact, he wrote an entire book about it. The book of Psalms, it reveals to us the poetry and the songs and the journal entries from David's journal that show us just how important it was for him to pay attention to his heart and to pay attention to his emotions. Let's look at a few of the Psalms that show us the emotions that David felt and how he paid attention to them. He evaluated his experiences through his emotions, and that allowed him to become the person that he wanted to become. I'm convinced it's in evaluating your emotions through your experiences that you can actually become the type of person that you want to become. So let's look at those Psalms right now. Psalm 77, a Psalm of David, reads in this way in the first 3 verses. I cry aloud to God that he may hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearing. My soul refuses to be comforted. I think of God and I moan. Then listen to this last line. I meditate and my spirit faints. See, David was a man that was completely in touch with his emotions, and he was very honest with God about his emotions. Not only that, at the end of that verse 3, he says these words, I meditate on my emotions. See, here's what David's saying. He took the time to think about his emotions, not just think about them, but that idea of meditating means to kind of chew over or to mull over the things that you're thinking about over and over and over again. He would meditate, think on, and chew over his emotions. And this helped him to become the person that he wanted to become. In Psalm 13, David says these words, How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear in my soul the pain and the sorrow that is in my heart all day long? David was very in touch with his emotions and his feelings, and he was very upfront with God about them. So, what would it look like for us living today in order for us to become the people that we want to become, to literally take a page from David's book, to literally take the practice that David applied and his son Solomon wrote about in the proverb, to begin mulling over, meditating on, and even learning from our experiences through the lens of our emotions. I'm convinced that this practice that David did of evaluating his experiences through the lens of his emotions was part of the way that he became the person that he wanted to become. So what does that look like for us today? Let's take a look right now. A practice that has been especially helpful for me has been combining actually something that's quite old with something that's maybe a little bit more new. It's combining the journaling practice that David did in writing the poetry and the Psalms with a practice that's about 400 years old, relatively new. It's called the Prayer of Examen, and it was developed by St. Ignatius, who was a monk living about 400 years ago, as I mentioned. He would come at the end of the day, and he would begin a prayer of examining his day that helped him to think through the events of his day through the lens of his emotions. I've taken the prayer of examen and combined it with journaling, and it's been a helpful tool for me to become the person that I want to become. So let me walk you through just the prayer of examen and talk to you about how you can begin to practice that and how that can turn into a journaling practice as well. Now, I know some of you may be listening to this, and so far you've been thinking, yeah, this is pretty good. I'm not a follower of Jesus or a Bible person, but I can understand the practices of David and Solomon, how they could be helpful for me. I want you to just for a moment lean into this prayer of examen, even if you wouldn't call yourself a Christian or a follower of Jesus, and see how you might be able to take this and develop a practice at the end of your day that will help you to become the person you want to become. Here's how the prayer of examen starts out. It starts by just pausing to become aware of God's presence in your life. Just pausing and kind of saying, okay, God, I've had a lot of events today. A lot of things have taken place. Would you just speak to me during this time as you pause? Then the next thing you're going to do is review your day, but review it with an attitude of gratitude. That's a great way. Even if you've had some things happen throughout the day, some experiences that weren't necessarily positive, be grateful for even those experiences because of the lessons that you can learn from them. And then the next thing is to do this. Pay attention to the emotions that you felt throughout all of the different experiences in your day. You might have had some boredom throughout the day. You might have been elated by certain experiences. You might have been confused or even discouraged by some of the experiences throughout the day. Make sure you pay attention to those emotions that are tied to those experiences. If you're like me, you may not have grown up thinking about your emotions that much, and so I want to share with you a tool that's been super helpful for me. I take out the emotions wheel, I keep it on my phone, and then when I begin to think of events and experiences throughout the day, I try to assign an emotion to each one of those events and experiences that stand out. And then finally, I grab a pen, I grab a journal or a piece of paper, and I'll write about maybe one or two of the most important events and experiences that stand out in that day and how they made me feel. It's been incredible for me as I tap into my inner life of how I'm feeling and my emotions, that now I'm more aware of those all throughout the day, not just at the end of the day through the prayer of examen. Lastly, I try to choose an emotion from the day that I want to write about and dive deep into. And then I begin to look into the day that's coming tomorrow. I begin to think about the experiences that I have on my calendar, or the events, the people that I'm going to see. And I begin to decide ahead of time, how do I want to go into those experiences? How do I want to feel? What emotions do I want to bring into those experiences? And what's the type of person that I want to be in each of those? This has been an incredibly helpful practice for me, and I believe it can be incredibly helpful for you as well. Imagine the difference it'll make as you travel through life on the pathway and the journey of life and evaluate your experiences through the lens of your emotions. Imagine the difference that will make in becoming the person that you want to become. I want to challenge you this week, perhaps every night or at least one night, to grab a piece of paper or a journal and to evaluate your experiences from that day through the lens of your emotions. I'm convinced that this practice that David and his son Solomon talked about from thousands of years ago helped them become the people that they wanted to become. Not get more done, but help them focus on who they wanted to become. And I think it can help each of us to do just that as well. So, grab a piece of paper, grab a journal, and begin to focus on our bottom line for today's lesson, evaluating your experiences through the lens of your emotions will help you to become the person you want to become.